On September 15, 1939, the German assault on Poland reached a new level of intensity as the Wehrmacht continued its methodical encirclement and bombardment of Warsaw. The Polish capital remained under siege, its defenders struggling against overwhelming odds as they sought to delay the inevitable as long as possible. Meanwhile, the Allies faced mounting criticism for their continued inaction, and the international community closely watched as the events in Poland unfolded. This day highlighted the determination of the Polish resistance, the strategic inertia of the Allied powers, and the growing global implications of the conflict. The German offensive, closing the noose around Warsaw. By September 15th, the German Wehrmacht had solidified its positions around Warsaw, effectively completing the encirclement of the city. The blitzkrieg tactics, rapid advances by armored units supported by mechanized infantry and devastating airstrikes, had left Polish forces scattered and largely isolated. With Warsaw surrounded, German forces aimed to pressure the city into surrender through a combination of ground assaults and relentless aerial bombardment. On this day, German units continued to probe Warsaw's defenses, testing the Polish resistance and looking for weak points to exploit. The Luftwaffe intensified its bombing campaign, targeting both military and civilian infrastructure in an attempt to break the morale of the defenders and the civilian population. Reports from within the city indicated widespread destruction and a mounting toll on both military personnel and civilians. Entire districts lay in ruins, and the constant threat of bombing raids left the population in a state of perpetual fear. The German strategy remained focused on forcing a quick surrender to avoid the prolonged urban combat that had characterized earlier conflicts. The German High Command was keen to minimize its casualties and conserve resources for future operations in Europe. Propaganda continued to frame the campaign as a justified action, necessary to protect Germany's security and interests in the region. This narrative was aimed at maintaining public support for the war and boosting the morale of German troops on the front lines. The Polish defense, defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite the dire circumstances, the Polish defenders of Warsaw remained determined to hold out as long as possible. Under the leadership of General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, efforts were made to strengthen the city's defenses and prepare for a potential ground assault by German forces. Civilians were mobilized to assist in building fortifications, digging trenches, and supporting the military in any way possible. On September 15th, the Polish defenders continued to fortify key positions throughout the city, creating makeshift barricades and preparing for street-to-street fighting should the Germans attempt a full-scale assault. The Polish Air Force, though severely weakened, made sporadic attempts to engage the Luftwaffe and protect the city from aerial attacks. These efforts were largely symbolic, but they provided a morale boost to the defenders and demonstrated the resilience of the Polish resistance. The humanitarian situation in Warsaw was becoming increasingly desperate. Hospitals were operating beyond capacity, and essential supplies, including food, water, and medical equipment, were running dangerously low. The constant bombardment made it difficult to distribute aid or evacuate civilians from heavily affected areas. Despite these challenges, the spirit of defiance among Warsaw's residents remained strong. Mayor Starzyński continued to deliver daily radio broadcasts, urging the population to stay resolute and resist the German invaders at all costs. However, the reality of the situation was bleak. With the city completely surrounded and no prospect of relief from the Allies, the defenders faced a stark choice: continue to resist in the hope of delaying the German advance, or surrender to avoid further civilian casualties and destruction. The decision was further complicated by the knowledge that surrender would likely lead to harsh reprisals and occupation by German forces. Allied hesitation, strategic calculations, and growing criticism. As Warsaw faced increasing pressure from the German assault, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, continued to face criticism for their lack of decisive action. The decisions made at the Abbeville Conference on September 12th, where British and French leaders had opted to delay any immediate offensive against Germany, left Poland to face the German onslaught alone. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government was under growing pressure from both the public and political opponents to take more decisive action. Many in Britain felt that the government had failed to honor its commitments to Poland, and there was a growing sense of frustration over the perceived lack of a coherent strategy to confront Nazi aggression. On September 15th, discussions within the British War Cabinet continued to focus on potential military actions, such as air raids on German industrial targets or a more aggressive naval blockade to weaken the German war effort. However, logistical challenges, concerns about provoking a broader conflict before the British military was fully prepared, and fears of heavy civilian casualties led to continued hesitation. The Royal Air Force (RAF) focused on reconnaissance missions and defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade, aiming to weaken Germany economically over the long term. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French army remained heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west. The limited incursions into the Saar region were more symbolic than substantive, reflecting the French military's cautious approach to engaging German forces directly. Many within France were growing increasingly disillusioned with the government's strategy, which seemed to prioritize avoiding immediate conflict over actively supporting Poland. The failure of the Allies to launch a meaningful counteroffensive or provide significant direct support to Poland reflected broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of repeating the catastrophic losses of World War I and were concerned about the readiness of their forces for a prolonged conflict. However, this cautious approach also meant that Poland, their ally, was effectively left to face the German onslaught alone. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic reconsiderations. The continuing encirclement of Warsaw and the broader German campaign in Poland prompted strong reactions from the international community, leading many nations to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly evolving conflict. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 15th, discussions within the U.S. government focused on the possibility of expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin and his advisors continued to closely monitor the situation in Poland. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, and as German forces advanced deeper into Polish territory, the Soviet Union prepared to assert its interests in the eastern part of the country. The Red Army remained on high alert, ready to intervene when the time was deemed appropriate. Soviet propaganda maintained a narrative of neutrality, while preparations for potential military action were underway behind the scenes. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 15th, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 15th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the worsening situation in Warsaw and the ongoing deliberations within the British government. Coverage emphasized the resilience of the Polish defenders and the need for national unity and readiness for a prolonged conflict. Editorials called for increased support for Poland and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the limited military actions in the Saar region. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to push the narrative of a justified war effort, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht in Poland and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the war as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the United States, newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post provided extensive coverage of the events in Europe, with detailed analyses of military movements and diplomatic developments. The American press remained largely neutral but increasingly recognized the potential implications of the conflict for U.S. foreign policy and global stability. Opinion pieces explored the debate over isolationism versus engagement, reflecting the ongoing uncertainty within American society about the nation's role in the world. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 15, 1939, highlighted the rapid escalation of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked another critical phase in the defense of Warsaw, as the city prepared for a siege that would test its endurance and resolve. The Polish government's appeals for more substantial Allied support reflected a growing sense of desperation, as the promised assistance seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive in time to make a meaningful difference. For the United Kingdom and France, the day underscored the complexities of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict that they had hoped to avoid and were grappling with the strategic uncertainties of how best to respond to German aggression. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support Poland directly, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Internationally, the events of September 15th prompted further reassessments and strategic recalibrations. The United States maintained its official stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential global implications of the conflict. The Soviet Union, Italy, and other nations watched closely, each calculating how best to navigate the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 15, 1939, was a day of intensifying conflict and growing uncertainty, as the rapid German advance in Poland and the hesitant Allied response highlighted the complexities of the early days of World War II. The unfolding events revealed the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability. For the nations involved, it was a time of critical decisions and strategic positioning, as they sought to navigate a war that was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. For the people of the world, it was a time of fear, hope, and resilience, as they faced the prospect of another devastating conflict and the challenges that lay ahead. The events of September 15th set the stage for a war that would reshape the political, social, and economic landscape of the 20th century, leaving an indelible mark on history.